the data is national, produced by the Bureau of the Census. Now, you could collect just the observations for Minnesota, but that would leave you with a much smaller sample. And what you want is the largest sample possible, so that you get a better cross-section for your average results. You know? And those of you who had statistics remember that sample size matters. And so you could do it focused on Minnesota. You could apply the models just to Minnesota data. I'm not sure I think that's a useful approach, but it can be done. I have not done it.
But isn't the sample sizes that, in looking over, and I know we'll get to this, the sample sizes that were used in your model are, I believe there was 5,600.
Something like that.
And then 1,300, something like that. So certainly that size sample could be accumulated for the state of Minnesota.
You'd have to do it yourself. It's not what the Bureau of the Census does. What I said is that if you take the census data, and we do know their zip codes, so we could just limit it to Minnesota. So that's doable. But if you did that, it'd be a much smaller sample. That's 5,000 for the whole nation. So Minnesota is what percentage of the nation? You guys know that better than I do. And so you can guess what the percentage is. And also, then you divide these samples in terms of the number with one child, the number with 2 children, number of 3+ children, the number without children. The sample size go down awfully quickly. And so you could do it, but you'd lose accuracy because you'd be surprised how much quickly the sample size would diminish. Now, if the state of Minnesota wanted to replicate the Bureau of the Census and to run it, to run your own survey, more power to you. It's an expensive proposition. So it can be done. Of course it can be done. But no state runs their own surveys, really, because the federal survey is quite so. But it does have the limitation. These are national numbers. The only thing I can say is that all of us use national numbers. And you could ask that to Dr. Venor next month and ask her what she says about that. My guess is she'd say something similar, but I don't know. Seems to be the best I can say. All right.
Just a reminder to please state your name prior to asking your question.
Anything else?
Okay. We did have a question come in from the audience.
Good.
Yes, question is, what year was the USDA data collected?
It's not the USDA data. It's the Bureau of the Census data that collects it in every year. But what's interesting is that the USDA doesn't always use the most recent data. I have here, I've read all their reports. The 1909 report uses the 2009 report uses, I believe, 2006 data. I better check the numbers. And they just updated it in terms of using the consumer price index to make it current levels. So not every USDA report rests on the most recent Bureau of the Census data. Why they change it, I don't know. But it's there in the reports, and they're upfront about it. And at the break, I'll try to find that particular quote from the 2009 report, and you can see what they say. Right? But okay.
Okay, just a question also.
Oh, sure.
This is Lisa Coles. So can you tell us of the 3 models, what year of data the 3 models most recent is? Are they all using fairly recent?
Yes. Let me get the reports out. most recent USDA report is in 2015. Here it is. It's not the one that I use to compare, but it is available. I have to look and see whether they use the most recent data. I can't, without going through it, I can't tell you right now. You're welcome to look through it if you want. No, I don't think so. But, the USDA does not always use the most recent data for reasons of their own. That's as much as I can say.
So, this is Kathleen. So
Please
I'm
call
on-
me Bill. I'm okay with that. It's okay.
It's a sign of
We're all,
respect.
we're all,
So when you're talking about the statistics that you presented to us, what year?
I'm going to talk about that now. All right, let me say that. All right. All right. Now, the USDA typically uses 1 year's worth of data in their reports because they do it each year. I guess if I was sitting in those shoes, I would do the same thing. But what we did is we used 4 years of data. We used data from 2006, 7, 8, and 9. And because the price levels changed, not very much, but a little bit over that time, we corrected all the numbers according to the Consumer Price Index to make them all comparable for 2009. So we did what they did for all the previous years. Why did we do this? So that we had a larger sample. The larger sample you have, the more accurate your estimate. That's standard statistics. And we compared our results with the 2009 data from the USDA. We compared our 4-year results with their 1-year results to make it, we thought was the best, most comparability we could do. You'll see that. Let me get the 2009 report and emphasize I have the 2009 report, which is the one that we compare our results with. And first of all, in terms of the data, it emphasizes that the consumer expenditure data is, as it says, the most comprehensive source of information on household expenditures available at the national level. And this is just reading from their report. And I agree with them on that, absolutely. But then it says, and again I'm reading, although based on 2005-2006 data, the expense estimates were updated to 2009 dollars by using the Consumer Price Index. So even though this is a 2009 report, it doesn't rest on 2009 data. It rests on 2005-2006 data. But that's okay. Actions, these types of expenditures, in principle, don't change very much over time. I don't criticize them for that. It's the model, not the data, which lies at the heart of it. That's my pitch, and I think it's correct. Do you want to see this?
No, I'm fine, thank you.
All of these reports are here, and you all can look at them if you want. Okay, so I emphasize that moving from the costs of raising children to child support awards and the guidelines is a different matter. Right? And since I'm not going to deal with that, I focused, to the extent we focused on child support awards, we dealt with the base case, which is what we call it. The base case is a case where the non-custodial parent has 100% of the income and the custodial parent has 100% of the parenting time. I want to emphasize That's not the normal thing in many circumstances. It's not the appropriate thing. I don't support it, but it forces us to focus on what I want to deal with, which is the costs. So I'm going to use the base case, but I'm not going to say that should be the basis of your policy decisions. I'm focusing on that only to emphasize the economic issues as opposed to the policy ones. Right. We talked about that at lunch, and I wanted to make that point. All right, maybe we should go on to my next slide. Let me say something about myself. As I think I told you, I've never done anything else besides being a professor. And I teach at two campuses at the University of California. One in the Department of Economics and one in the School of Public Health. And I have a PhD 50 years ago. You can probably believe that, but it's true nevertheless. And people say, well, why don't you retire? And I said, this is so much fun. Why would you ever do that? So I don't retire. They don't. Luckily, I have tenure, so they can't force me to retire. Right? If I didn't have tenure, I think I'd be out. But there we go. I did have 2 tours in government. My most recent one was as chief economist of the Federal Trade Commission. So there I had to be a policymaker, not just an economist. So I'm aware of the issues that in making policy, it needs to rely on more than merely economics. But economics is insightful, I hope, for policy decisions. And that's what I tried to do at the Federal Trade Commission, and that's what I want to do here as well. I write mainly in the areas of antitrust law or pharmaceutical economics, but I've also done some work in household economics. Right. Let's go over that. Now, let me emphasize one further point. My purposes here are purely academic. Right? Sometimes that's good, sometimes it's bad. But I don't really have any conflicting goals. I don't want a consulting contract. My teaching schedule is full-time, more than full-time. And to the extent that I do consulting, it's not based on child support issues at all. Right? And here's how I got into this. I think maybe you ought to know that. I attended a conference back many years ago, and I learned a factor which struck me as surprising, which is that child rearing cost figures, which underlay child support awards, did not, underline not, did not rest on actual expenditures. They did not. They were imputed and not actual values. And I don't know that that's a well-known reality, but it's true. But the 2014 Minnesota Child Support Guideline Review said that, which is exactly right. There's the quote from the Minnesota recent review. It does not measure direct spending on the child. It has imputed values which follow from the models which are employed. That quote emphasizes the critical importance of the models which are employed. Because the existing child support award figures do not rest on actual expenditures. And your own report says that, and it's absolutely true. My pitch here is that because everything rests on the models, we have to pay serious attention to the models which are used. Any questions about that? Yeah.
So what do we mean by not actual expenditures? Is that not actually for an individual case?
From the data tells us expenditures, right? So we could measure it with expenditures, but we don't. I'm going to do it. My approach is to focus on the actual expenditures, but even I had to make some adjustments, and I'll tell you why. You know, you've all heard the principle that the devil lies in the details. You've all heard that, right? It's really true here. It's really true here. And so what I want to do with you today is to lead you through the details. And you can disagree with me, fair enough. But I want you to understand what the details are. Right? And it's especially relevant because it all depends on the models which are employed. For 2014,
Sorry, did you want me to?
yeah, go back, no.
Okay,
no,
go back, sorry.
No, go back. The 2014 Minnesota Review says it, and it's right. Yeah.
This is Jeff Jorgensen. Just as a comment too, that would be correct for all of the states.
Yes,
Right.
yes, it's not Minnesota unique at all. It's the way things are done now, which I found so, to be sure, upsetting when I first encountered this. So that's how I got into this game. That is literally how I got into this game. You know, as a professor, you can pick your battles. And I said, why is that the case? Why don't we do it the right way? Right? At least, why don't we do it more directly? And so I said, well, you can't fight something with nothing. You have to do it yourself. Well, it took me 10 years to do it. Right? And you'll see. Right. Let's go to the next one. So you can see that this issue arose in my head in 2003, and I finally published a paper in 2015. What took you so long? It wasn't so simple, besides I didn't have a big grant. That was the big thing. And I needed some colleagues to do all the work, right? So I found some colleagues who were not professors, one of whom was a partner of a big consulting firm and had excess capacity to run the numbers. And he ran the numbers for me with his assistants. So I tried to specify the equations, and my colleagues ran the numbers. Working with U.S. Census data, while it's all there, it's not so easy. You know, it's not so easy to take the right variables from that disk and program it correctly and do the analysis. You know, gathering the data from the U.S. Census and then putting 4 years worth of data all together and merging them. I mean, that's a 5-year enterprise. And that's why it took us so long. Then you can see the quote from the federal regulations. The whole purpose of this enterprise, so the federal regulations say, is to divide fairly the burdens of child rearing, the economic burdens of child rearing. And that's really what my presentation deals with. Not the division, but rather, what are those burdens? How do you measure the economic burdens of child rearing? That's from their quote. That's the federal regulation. Okay? Any issues about that? Anything you want to say? Comments?
Just
Sure.
Pamela Wagner, just getting back to something you said about when you're gathering the data, you're selecting certain variables. And so don't those variables then have certain outcomes? So if you preclude other variables and you're only gathering certain variables, cannot that be a difference in the analysis and the outcome?
Absolutely right. But look, what variables do you gather? The variables that fit your model. And so you form the model, and then you say, what variables can we get to work with our model, work in the confines of our model? So we don't choose a variable willy-nilly. We choose a variable to fit with the model which is pre-selected. And so, yes, if we had a different model, we would select different variables. That's exactly right. Exactly right. And that's probably one part of the reason why we get different results. It's because different variables are needed for different models. But the way to think of it, I believe, is to think about which model you want. You're not too certain. I'm trying to read I try to read all my students' faces, and when they're not sure, I say, we're not going on until I get you to agree.
I think that my question then, I guess to follow up, would be the pre-selection of a specific model will bias the outcome because you're choosing specific variables. And that's true in all three models.
You were exactly right. You are precisely right. So therefore, the selection of the model matters, doesn't it? That's where it's at. And and exactly for the reason that you just said. Exactly right. That's why we have to be really careful which model we prefer. All right? I think you put it better than I could put it. So and so it's you put it. I didn't link it to the selection of variables, but that's fully correct. Okay, all right.
Doctor?
Yes. Oh, maybe I can. Can I ask? Can I call on him?
I was just going to say, sometimes we get the static over the mics because people's cell phones or electronic devices are too close to the mics, so just to keep that in mind. Sorry.
No problem. No problem. Should I turn mine off? I don't know
I think you're good. I think you're good. You're not close enough to a mic, I don't think so.
Do you want to ask a question? We haven't had.
No, I just wanted, I didn't want to interrupt you, but I wanted to let people know that was the deal. So you can go ahead and...
My students say the same thing. I'm really sorry I said anything.
Okay, that's fine.
You have a question?
I did. My question, I'll hand in paper after I ask a question, so it's easier to say it than write it. So.
I understand that. Please ask your question.
Go on.
So when you're talking about the model and you're talking about the variables, it seems like the bigger question is, what are the basis of your biases for the model?
Exactly right.
So is it monetary? Is it fairly for each person? Is that
It-
what?
The models should be employed to best represent the underlying reality.
And how hard is that to get it implemented when you're dealing with government?
I honestly don't think that's the issue.
Okay.
I think the issue is the intellectual one of selecting among the models in terms of which is a better representation of reality. And that's where perfectly reasonable economists can differ. Of course, we all think we're right. That's the world, right? But the other person will think they're right. And it's up to this board, this group, to decide. Right? At least that's the way I see it. Okay, where are we? Okay, now if you go to the data, but even apart from the data, the reality is that certain expenditures are made specifically for children. Right? We all know that. Right? Clothing and childcare. You don't make them without children. So it's easy to say how much how much should be allocated for children. We can just measure it. However, what about these other categories? And these other categories are called household collective goods. You've all heard about this. This is nothing new for you. And households make them with or without the presence of children. And how should they be divided? And it turns out that the issue of how to divide those expenditures is the source of all the issues involved. That factor is the source of all. And the three models divide these expenditures in three different ways. Really. The essence of the issues among the models, the primary ones, are how to divide household expenditures across the members of the household. Because the data is household expenditures. It's household expenditures, and it's not individual expenditures, except with regard to clothing. Right? They do distinguish. The Bureau of the Census data does distinguish between adult clothing and children's clothing, but it clearly doesn't do it in terms of the major ones of housing, food, and transportation. So the issue of how to divide those expenditures is the issue which led to all the what I see as the problems. Am I going to be able to talk like this for 4 hours? I don't know. We'll see. I'll probably lose my voice, but I've done that before.
Bill, I have a question.
Sure.
This is Jeff Jorgensen. I don't know if this is in the material you're going to cover, but how do you classify other costs? So like what you have here are, I think, things you kind of needs, not wants. But you have other costs with children like, I don't know, a sports thing or whatever. That would be outside of housing and food. And how does your model, or how do you classify that particular category of cost?
The cheap way to answer your question,
I'm cheap.
and
That's true.
the non-responsive way, which is also the non-responsive way to answer your question, is that I do it just the way the Bureau of the Census does it. Because we use their data. However they do it, we do it.
Sure.
They include certain things as children, as clothing, and maybe like a uniform. And they have a miscellaneous category, but it's relatively small. And we ignore the miscellaneous category because it doesn't give you any good results. If you run it, the statistics are all over the lot, so you can't get anything there. In most of it, I suspect, it lies within child care and education.
Okay.
And I'd have to go back and look more precisely at the definitions given by the Bureau of the Census. And I want to emphasize, and everybody, you'll ask this, and I expect others will as well. How do you specify particular items in these categories? And I didn't do it. The Census Bureau did. But here's my factor, my reliance. That's not only what I did, but it's what the other guys did too.
Right.
We all did the same thing, right? Because we all rely on the decisions made by the Census Bureau of what expenditures fall in which category. We didn't make those decisions. And that's true when you speak in a month from now with Dr. Venora. She didn't make those decisions either. And the USDA did not make those decisions either. Those decisions were made by the statisticians at the Bureau of the Census.
and they made them on the basis of what they thought was reasonable. Statisticians